Good evening. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and I am here tonight with our special guest, Dr. Laura Muñoz. Tonight, we're going to learn about Mexican Arizona and the politics of educational equality. Tonight's talk is part of Dream Week, an annual series of events across San Antonio to celebrate our humanity by creating environments for civil and civic engagement to embrace ideas and dreams for the common good. Dream Week is inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy. And this year, when we were thinking about our Dream Week events, we wanted to highlight education and particularly the ways our community has had to actively work to access education. And we all know that education is critical to achieving our dreams. So we're very excited to have our special guest tonight, Dr. Laura Muñoz, who's the author of Desert Dreams.
Oh, wow.
Mexican Arizona. You see how it all connects. Yes, Mexican Arizona and the politics of educational equality. So Dr. Muñoz is an assistant professor of history and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research focuses on Mexican American, Chicanx, and Latinx communities in the United States, with an emphasis on race, gender, and education in the American West. Prior to joining the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, she was the Joe B. France Associate Professor of American History at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. She's taught courses on U.S. history, Mexican American history, and U.S. Latinx history. She's published 2 book chapters, as well as 2 articles in the History of Education Quarterly and the Western Legal History Journal. Her article, Civil Rights, Educational Inequality, and Transnational Takes on the U.S. History Survey in the History of Education Quarterly, received the William and Edwina Gilbert Award in 2017. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Dr. Muñoz received her PhD from Arizona State University in 2006. So welcome, Dr. Muñoz.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here. Very excited to share with you for the very first time Desert Dreams and to discuss the experience of Arizonenses, Arizona Mexicans in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll start this conversation.
Great. And just bear with us as we get this up. Here we go.
Okay. So there's my title page. I was super fabulous to have the mentorship of not only my dissertation director, Vicky Ruiz, but of Dr. Stephen Pitty, who's on the board of MACRI. And he shepherded this book to press at the University of Pennsylvania Press. So my thanks goes to him and to the fine people at Penn Press who helped me do this. I want to start out with a couple of frameworks for you. Many people are less sure of Arizona or Arizonense Mexican American history because very few of us have written about it. And so I wanted to sort of present a map to you to give you a sense of the space geographically that I'll be speaking about. One of the things that I find important and that is critical to my work is that I look at Mexican American experience across the entire state. And so if you notice on this map, there are a number of black dots starting up here at Flagstaff. And in each of these towns with a black dot, the majority of children in those towns in the public schools were Mexican American in the 1920s. So we're talking about a state that literally from the beginning of the 20th century had a majority Mexican American student body in its public schools. So the question of Mexican American education was critically important. From the moment Arizona becomes part of the United States. And I point out to you a couple of dates here, 1848, of course, the Mexican-American War, and this region, northern part, basically, from Phoenix north, is ceded to the United States. And then with the Gadsden Purchase, the border moves farther south into Sonora, and this is where Nogales, Bisbee, and Douglas, and of course the great city of Tucson become part of Arizona. The territory is actually originally part of New Mexico, and it becomes Arizona territory in 1863, and then eventually the 48th state in 1912. So those are some important dates and important geographies for you to consider as we go on. Another thing I wanted to point out for you was a timeline. One of the earliest pieces that I was able to publish on the state of Arizona and Mexican American education was an article on Romo versus Laird, the very first Mexican American desegregation court case filed by Arizona Mexican Americans. This case was a Superior Court case in Maricopa County. It took place, the events surrounding it, in the city of Tempe, which is the home of Arizona State University. During this time period, Arizona State University was known as the Arizona State Teachers College, and that college also incorporated a Mexican school or a Mexican training school onto its campus. It borrowed this school from the city of Tempe. And it's this sort of moment of desegregation that sort of centers the work that I study. Because one of the questions that came up for me was, well, what happened before we began to segregate Mexican American children? And then what happened after Mexican Americans start filing these court cases? So my text goes from 1870 to 1950 because I'm asking these questions about what happened before and after Romo versus Laird. The Romo case gets filed in 1925 by Joaquina Quina Jones Romo and her husband, Adolfo Bebé Romo. You see both of them here. And then you also see the 8th Street School, which was the designated Mexican school in the town of Tempe. The district actually gave the Teachers College permission to use this campus for the training of student teachers. And those student teachers taught a student body that was segregated by the town. All of the children at this school were Mexican American, and they were placed there because of their ethnic identity. Students were not tested for Spanish language ability or English language ability. Students were not tested in any way, shape, or form to see how they had succeeded or had been succeeding in the Americanizing programs. They were basically, by ethnic identity, separated from white children in the town of Tempe. These parents filed their lawsuit with the support of the entire community. Not only are they acting on behalf of Mexican Americans in Tempe, they're also being sponsored by and supported by the Alianza Hispanoamericana, which comes out of Tucson in the late 1800s. They're also members of other Mexican American mutual aid associations in the region as well. So this becomes seen as a symbol of Mexican American protest in the state. Segregation was standard. Students could be segregated in many different ways. In many schools, particularly in small rural communities, like Gilbert, District Number 41, this particular town was outside of, on the edge of Maricopa County, so greater Phoenix metro area. But the community was so small that Mexican children were simply segregated into their own classrooms. So this image, which comes from the Arizona State Archives, shows us the first grade of Mexican pupils at Gilbert School in the 1920s. In other towns where there were significant numbers of Mexican American children, entire schools would be set aside for Mexican children. So this is an example also from 1920 from Southern Arizona for a community that no longer exists because it was a mining community known as Ray. And in the Ray School District, there were 2 schools. One school was set up for Mexican descent children. Those children attended the Sonora School, which you see here. And then children who are non-Mexican or identify as Euro-American or white American, Anglo-American, if you will, those students attended basically the Ray Elementary School. What's amazing about a photo like this is how ordinary segregation was in the daily life of Mexican Americans in Arizona in the 1920s. Segregation is as ordinary as the basketball hoop that you see in this playground. You'll notice in the foreground here the shadow of the basketball hoop. This is an everyday school experience for Mexican American children throughout the state. This segregation is not something that occurred immediately upon American control of the region. In fact, it develops in very mismatched ways depending on the interests of the communities. And Rebecca Muñoz and her sisters, Lucinda and Elizabeth, that you see here in this image, attended a number of schools in Arizona in the 20s and 30s, along with their brothers and sisters, because their parents were ministers. Methodist ministers from Mexico who came into the United States, first into Texas and then eventually into Arizona and California. And as they set up Methodist Spanish-speaking churches throughout the American Southwest, their children attended all kinds of schools in all different types of towns throughout the state of Arizona. So in one of their oral histories, they explain, Elizabeth in particular explains the different types of segregation that she encountered. And this was pretty standard for all Mexican American children throughout the state. Depending on their parents' movements, whether their parents moved for work, moved for jobs, moved for better pay, whether they're moving from rural communities to urban communities, the racial scripts, the ways that whites, Mexicans, Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans interact with each other in those communities shaped the way that segregation played out in the local schools. So children could go to mixed Anglo and Mexican schools. Children could go to all Mexican schools if they were perceived as being Americanized enough, and if they spoke English well enough, they could go to all Anglo schools. And some children also advanced to Phoenix Union High School. And this was important, the shift from completing an elementary education through the 8th grade, earning that 8th grade graduation certificate. That certificate becomes your passport into high school. Mexican American parents are really pushing their children in, definitely by the 1920s, to obtain that 8th grade certificate so that they could enter Arizona high schools. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looked like for Mexican American youth across the state in this time period. So if we go back in time to 1871, this is right in the heart of territorial Arizona. The state, or the territory, has been formed in 1863. There are towns across the territory of Arizona. Tucson, for example, is probably one of the largest towns. It is a community that has a history that's connected to Spanish colonization and exploration in the region. And so there have been Mexican Americans living in Tucson for at least 100 years. By the time that the United States makes a claim on the territory. There were some Mexican schools established by Mexicans who'd settled in the region, but those schools were not necessarily part of the local government or part of the fabric of what we would think of as a territorial school system. It's not until 1871 that Tucson representative Esteban Ochoa, who you see here in the image, is able to convince the territory and the territorial legislature, with the support of the governor, Governor Safford, to pass an official school law. So in 1871, he co-sponsors what's considered the territorial school law that sets the tone and really sets all of the requirements for establishing public schools throughout the entire territory. Unfortunately, this particular law did not include funding. So this meant that Mexican American parents who are residing in these communities throughout Arizona are having to make some really serious, tough decisions about how they're going to educate their children. And amazingly, these parents choose to finance the schools themselves. Esteban Ochoa, for example, is one of these people who reaches into his own pocket. He's a well-known businessman in the community, probably the wealthiest Mexican descent person in Tucson before 1880. And he hires his own company to go out into the mountains to cultivate and chop down all of the wood necessary to build what essentially will become Congress Street School in Tucson, Arizona. He also pays for the labor once the county runs out of funds. And so he literally finances the creation of the Tucson public schools. Mexican American women also are very involved in helping to create at the exact same time private school opportunities through the Catholic Church. And Mexican American wives in particular are responsible for helping to finance by convincing their husbands to make donations to the Catholic Church to help set up a private school system. So we have in place Mexican American parents who are committed to education, who want their children educated, and who are willing to literally pay for that education, whether it's in the public school system or private school system. The Sotelo family in Tempe is a great example of how families mobilized to shape the public schools. In fact, the Sotelos are pretty amazing because Manuela Sanchez Sotelo, who you see in the center here, came to Tempe, Arizona from Mexico. She comes to the town upon the death of her husband. Her husband, Tiburcio, actually is in the process of making a land claim in the town of Tempe. He and his sons, some of his older sons, come into Tempe as migrant laborers. They help create the ditches that form essentially the water system in Tempe and in the East Valley of Maricopa County. And because of their work, they're able to make not only land claims, but water claims in this particular town. Upon Tiburcio's death, Manuela takes it upon herself to claim, literally, her husband's investments in Tempe. She moves her entire family, her 11 children, into the town of Tempe, and she sets up essentially one of the very first homesteads in that particular town. Not only does she do that, she encourages her children to consider the possibility of education. And her oldest daughter, Maria, who you see here on the far right, eventually marries a local man named Winchester Miller, who is a friend of her brothers and was a friend of her father's. And the two of them help sponsor the Tempe School District number 3. In fact, Winchester Miller becomes one of the very first elected school trustees of that particular school district. Now, this is the exact same school district that in 1925 will segregate Mexican American children. But here we have in the Sotelos the foundation of Mexican American education within the town of Tempe. Now, these public schools served every child, regardless of race or ethnic identity. I will say, though, Native American children were under the control of the federal government, and Native American children, for the most part, were not incorporated into the public schools. Tempe does do some work with Yaqui children in small settlements around Maricopa County, but very few of those children matriculate into the local public schools. So these ideas of race really, truly shape the ways that Mexicans, whites, Native Americans interface with one another in education and in the local schools. In the case of the Sotelos, I find them to be an incredible example for two reasons. One, their granddaughters, great-granddaughters, and great-great-granddaughters, 3 of whom I've listed here, took it upon themselves to record the history of their mothers and grandmothers. And in those histories, in those retellings, they identify that Manuela Sanchez Sotelo actually donated land and money to the local community when it wanted to literally build what was known as the very first normal school in the state of Arizona. That normal school, known as Tempe Normal School, which will eventually become Arizona State University, is literally built on the edge of her property in the town of Tempe. If you go to Tempe today, you'll see neighborhoods like the Sotelo Addition that are signals to us about this Sotelo family's past. And I think it's amazing that the families took it upon themselves not only to record that history, but to share that history with local archivists like Christine Marin, who helped shape and is responsible truly for the Chicano research collection at ASU. Who not only shared those stories with people like Chris, but eventually gave over documents and images like the ones you see here that detail their experience as Mexican Americans and their contributions to public education in the state. Eventually, Maria Sotelo Miller's daughters, Ana Manuela Miller and Clara Miller, for example, will become school teachers because they will enter not only the Tempe Public Schools at School District Number 3, but they'll go on to attend the Tempe Normal School to earn essentially the 2-year certificate after high school graduation that will allow them to teach in the state. And they become lifetime teachers in the state of Arizona, teaching not only in Tempe, but in towns like Buckeye, for example, around the state. In fact, Mexican Americans, and I should say Arizonenses, call themselves many different names. Some of them identify as Hispano, like Amelia Hunt, who you see here, and Monico Garcia. Also, they descend from New Mexican families that migrated into Arizona and established communities on the northeastern edge of the state. Others identified as Sonorenses or Sonorans because they migrated from Sonoran communities into southern Arizona. But regardless of where individuals are coming from, whether they're coming from historical New Mexican settlements, historical Sonoran settlements, they're identifying specifically as Arizona Mexicans or Arizonenses, and they're investing in the creation of new communities across the state, and in that process, investing in schools. Teachers from Mexican American families actually enter the public schools much earlier than we ever anticipated. And I give you a list here of some of the earliest, Amelia Hunt and Aurelia Borges being two of the earliest women who actually not only completed higher education, but completed the state exam for certification in 1891 and 1893. And then there are other women like Clara Priest, who, like the Sotelo Millers, also comes from Tempe and also comes from a mixed Anglo and Mexican family, who participated in public schools, went to the Tempe Normal School, for example, and eventually into the workforce as teachers. Petra Ochoa is another example of a young woman who attended the Tempe Normal School, earned her certificate, taught not only in the public schools, but also in Native American reservation schools. Monico, for example, went actually out of the state of Arizona. He went to what was known as one of the National Normal School, which is in the Midwest. And he attended school there for a few years before coming back to St. John's, earning his certificate in 1897. And eventually he'll earn the BA from Northern Arizona University. And then Carlos Tully and Alfred Ruiz, also men who pursued higher education, who were well known as teachers and superintendents in the county schools. In fact, Amelia Hunt, Monico Garcia, Carlos Tully, and Alfred Ruiz all would serve as county superintendents of education in the early 20th century and in the late 19th century. So there's a pattern here of Mexican American investment, not only in getting children through early education, but through high school and subsequently through college, so that they do have the capacity to come back into their communities and teach. One of these individuals, Aurelia Borges, eventually left the profession, and she did so for a variety of reasons. In fact, one of the things that she was frustrated with was these arguments over how Mexican American children should be educated. And there was such a force for Americanization and a desire to literally strip children of their ability to speak Spanish that she left the public teaching and actually returned to Mexico for a brief stint where she taught English in a high school there for girls. And then eventually she turned her expertise to writing and relocated to California and published a series of books. You have 3 of them here, for example, on how you teach Spanish to English-speaking children. In fact, her books become so popular that they're adopted by the California Department of Education. They're chosen as official textbooks and part of the standard Spanish curriculum for high school Spanish, conversational Spanish courses that are offered across the state. Her books also wind up in the New York Public Library. They are standard American Spanish language educational texts of the time. Mexican American youth and their parents are also pushing toward higher education. One of the ways they do this is to get their children into schools. One of the arguments that I've sort of struggled with is this idea of who gets to go to high school and who gets to go to college, and are these people from the elite within these communities? And in many times they are. They're coming from the middle classes. The Barneys, for example, their father also had attended college, and then he ensures that his own children go to public schools and, of course, high school and eventually to college. Barney himself, their father, is a man of mixed heritage, Anglo and Mexican heritage. And then he marries a Mexican-American woman, and they have several children, the 3 that you see here, who all graduated from Phoenix Union High School. And then you see others like the famous scholar George I. Sanchez, who attended Winslow High School in 1922. His parents were miners. Cuca Tiznado, whose parents were also working in the mines. She was just an average Mexican-American girl attending school in Jerome. Dolly Silva is another example. And of course, Chris Celaya from the well-known Celaya family in Tempe, in front of Tempe Union High School. These moments were so significant for these families that they often published announcements of these high school graduations in local Spanish language newspapers. So you see an example here of the Muñoz children who I showed you earlier, their graduations being announced, not only from high school, but from grammar school in the local Spanish language newspaper. These same children would make this transition to college as well. Here's 4 examples of young women of Latino heritage who graduated from college, and actually from all the 3 major institutions in Arizona in the time period, the Tempe Normal School, the Northern Arizona Teachers College, and of course the University of Arizona. All of these images I've pulled for the very first time for you to see as an example of how prevalent Mexican-American students were, not only in the high schools, but in the colleges in this time period. They also went to school with their cousins and with their siblings. So here's an example of the Urquidez and Romo cousins, and also of the sisters Amelia and Clotilde Fraide. All of these women, Maria Urquidez, Amelia and Clotilde, taught in the public schools in Arizona as well. Once they entered high school and subsequently went into college, they participated in many extracurricular activities. And the center point of many of those activities was participation in the Spanish Club. The Spanish Club became sort of an informal student organization for students of Mexican heritage. Most Mexican-American youth who are entering the public schools in this time period speak Spanish. That's the natal language, the language of their parents. And so they, like we do in the 21st century, joined the Spanish Club or took Spanish language classes in the high school levels. And here's an example of the Spanish Club in the La Cuesta yearbook, which is in Northern Arizona Teachers College in 1930. And what's significant about this is that you see Mexican-American or Arizonense youth taking up leadership in this particular club. So Emilia Vigil is the president of the Spanish Club in 1930. and the treasurer, Isais Flores. Both of them you see highlighted here in red. Students also began to formulate their own ethnic identity as Mexican Americans and began to question some of the politics of race in the United States. The very first Mexican American student organization in Arizona that was created specifically for Mexican American students was Los Conquistadores at Arizona State Teachers College. They were formed in 1938, again by the Muñoz siblings, and you see them here highlighted in red. The older son, Ros Muñoz, Rosalio Muñoz, and then two of his sisters in 1939 taking on leadership roles in the club as well. Los Conquis are significant because they are the very first organization of Mexican American youth at a college campus in the state of Arizona and possibly the United States who are articulating a Mexican American identity. They want a club specifically to serve their interests as Mexican descent students. So the goal in Los Conquistadores is not to improve the Spanish language or their ability to speak Spanish. Their goal is actually to advocate on behalf of Mexican American students to ensure their retention and their graduation at college, and also to recruit Mexican American youth from the state of Arizona to come to college in the late 1930s and early 40s. Many people were very interested in this topic, including the president of the college that they attended. In this case, you see Ros Muñoz standing against the wall here with the curly hair. And he helped organize with Los Conquis an annual breakfast with the president of the university. That's this gentleman right here, seated with glasses in the front. Grady Gamage was very, very open to Mexican American student concerns. He spent a number of years as a teacher and principal in the Arizona public schools before becoming president of the college. And in those schools, he was known for mentoring Mexican American teachers. So it was a natural connection, natural sense of interest between Gamage and these students on campus who are beginning to sort of articulate this concern about the future of Mexican Americans in the state of Arizona. And this is in particular in this post-segregation, or I should say post-Romo decade at the college. Segregation is still a reality in the state of Arizona in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. These youth are beginning to ask questions specifically about why that is the case. There's Gamage, there's Ros Muñoz. Los Conquis, as soon as they graduate from the Tempe Normal School, eventually go on to become teachers in the state of Arizona. Here's an example of a teacher's contract from St. John's. This was actually the contract that Ros Muñoz signed to teach in 1941 in the town of St. John's. And then this is a photo of what's known as the St. John's Gang, a group of teachers. Most of them were former Conquis, including Lucinda Muñoz, Inez Gomez, a descendant of the Romos as well, and Bill Lerma, students who found employment in this particular town. One of the things that these children, I'm calling them children, but they're adults here, one of the important things that they do is that they go into communities, particularly communities that are predominantly Mexican American, and teach in those schools with this targeted interest in uplift and support of Mexican American youth in the state. They're also very keen to the politics of race, and they recognize that in fact that they're dependent in some ways upon school districts and communities that have high levels or high numbers of Mexican American youth, because in some of the school districts across the state, there are limited opportunities, less interest in hiring Mexican American teachers. Phoenix Union High School and Phoenix Public Schools would be one example of that. They in fact had very few Mexican American teachers literally throughout the early 20th century up to World War II. Maybe a handful of Mexican Americans taught in the Phoenix schools, despite the number of Mexican Americans in the region. Here's Ross Muñoz in 1940, teaching in Concho. Concho is also on the outskirts of or near St. John's in northeastern Arizona. And he's teaching there in 1940. This is a pretty well-known photographer, Russell Lee, who works for the Farm Security Administration during the Great Depression. He went across the United States documenting the condition of rural people, particularly the conditions of poverty encountered in many communities throughout the Southwest during the Great Depression. And one of the towns he stopped in was Concho, and he got to visit Ross Muñoz's class. This is the image that I chose for the cover of the book because Ross Muñoz becomes an important thinker around issues of race, not only in the state of Arizona, but eventually he'll begin to influence politics in California when he leaves Arizona and becomes an important, one of the highest ranking Latino administrators in the LA public schools in the 50s and 60s. Teachers, aside from Los Conquis, are also thinking of themselves as advocates. They began to do this advocacy really quite early. As soon as Mexican Americans are entering the public schools, even going back to the 1890s with teachers like Amelia Hunt, they are articulating a particular need and concern for the Mexican American community. In fact, Amelia Hunt, who comes from a mixed Anglo-Mexican background, is fluent both in Spanish and English, and she, in the 1890s, hosts a variety of discussions at the teacher, what we might call teacher conferences or teacher conventions at the beginning of the school year, where she gives lectures on how you teach the Spanish-speaking child. So Mexican-American teachers from the get-go, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, are looking at the situation, both the economic condition, the political condition, the educational condition of Mexican American youth, and beginning to articulate a desire for change. In other words, how can we extend the promise of America, the promises of the United States, these constitutional rights to Mexican American people? And can we do that by starting at the educational within the educational framework? Maria Urquidez, you see here, that graduate who graduated from the Tempe Normal School in 1928, goes on to teach in the Tucson public schools for nearly 50 years. And during her the decades that she teaches there, beginning in 1928, she begins to establish a number of different programs along with Mexican-American parents and other Mexican-American teachers that will help support the Mexican-American community in Tucson. In fact, in the 1940s, she is responsible for helping to create a new community center, which today we know as Aury Park, that will help support Mexican-American youth and their parents in that particular neighborhood. She will go on, in fact, to become one of the most important figures in Arizona education in the 20th century. She'll begin to articulate by the 1940s a critique of Mexican-American education in the state. That critique being centered around this idea of segregation. In fact, Mexican-American leaders, those who are elected to the state legislature, those who have earned college degrees and have entered the professions such as the law or education, such as teachers, began to put together a platform to challenge Mexican school segregation in the 1940s. That Romo case in 1925 did not generate the kind of dismantling of segregation that Mexican Americans had imagined. It created an opening for some children to enter Anglo schools, but it didn't systematically destroy segregation in the state. And so by the 1940s, with this critical cadre of educated Mexican Americans, we began to see this challenge. In 1940, Mexican American parents introduced to the Arizona Education Association an attempt to end discrimination. And this effort is put forward by one of the representatives from Phoenix, Conrado Carrion, known as Jimmy Carrion. And he literally goes to the Arizona Education Association, attends their annual summer conference, and puts together a platform to dismantle segregation. And the Arizona Education Association is very interested in contemplating this possibility. Unfortunately, they're thwarted by World War II, which breaks out the same year that they consider this particular, I should say, request. So it's going to take the Mexican American community a good 5 years post World War II to start this affront a second time. And that's what you see here on the right. Segregation in schools is simply un-American. This effort is actually multiracial, African-American, Mexican-American, Anglo-American, all coming together to critique segregation as the status quo in the state. And they actually managed to get a referendum placed on the ballot in the state of Arizona, but it fails. Maria Urquidez is an important figure in this. Gregorio Garcia, a lawyer, and the brother of Monico Garcia, the brother-in-law of Amelia Hunt Garcia, is also an important figure in this movement. And he happens to be, at this time period, the president of the Alianza Hispanoamericana. So Mexican Americans, once they've achieved a level of education that has generated essentially a class of educated Mexican Americans in the state, those individuals bring with them that consciousness that their parents have cultivated over the decades to challenge the status quo within the state. So at this point, I'm going to stop. I know that I have a limited amount of time. I'm anxious for your questions. I do want to say thank you to Sara and Carla and all of MACRI for inviting me today to talk a little bit about some of the elements of Desert Dreams. And I'll jump out of this screen so we can do some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muñoz. You know, this is such an amazing study because I think that by centering that time period pre-1954, pre-Boundaries Board of Education, which I think is the kind of that segregation court case that most Americans are familiar with, you're saying there's this long history of not only school segregation, but people working to dismantle school segregation or the harms of school segregation long before then. And it's happening in Mexican American communities. So this is just like a double, to me, a double intervention. You know, it's way before 1954, and it's also happening in Mexican American communities. So thank you for this amazing body of research, and thank you for making the time to bring this to our general public, because I think, you know, that one of the things we exist to do is to take this knowledge that scholars like yourself are helping uncover and try to get that out to the general public. So thank you for being part of this.
Thank you.
I do have a few questions, and then I also just want to remind our viewers that they're welcome to type in their questions, and we'll share those with you. But I just want to say I have not finished reading the book, but I did start reading it. And one of the things that really did strike me is how it's very obvious that this topic is an area of passion for you. And I just wanted to ask, you do mention in here that you come from a family of educators. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about what this topic means to you?
Sure. Well, I guess I could start with my mom. My mom was a public school teacher for many years. She retired from the Corpus Christi, Texas public schools, but she was inspired to become an educator because her own mother did not get an education. Her mom attended segregated Mexican schools in the state of Texas. My great-grandmother, my grandmother's mom, was a migrant from Monterrey to South Texas and had to teach herself how to read and write. And so this access to education has always been tenuous for Mexican Americans. At the same time, my mom's grandmother on the paternal side of her family was a public school teacher in Brownsville, Texas in the early 1900s. So knowing that history for me raised all of these questions, like how can we be simultaneously educated and uneducated? How can we be simultaneously segregated and teaching in the public schools? So these are some of the questions that drove me to explore this history. And because I was studying my PhD in Arizona, and because Arizona had a normal school that had Mexican American students in attendance, I knew that that had to be the place I studied. So my heart really is divided between Arizona and Texas.
But this it is so enlightening, and I think that the Arizona story is, different from the Texas story in some ways, and so it's nice to be able to hear there were other things happening, but it wasn't just the Texas model that maybe some of us are a
Yeah.
little more
Mhm.
familiar with. Speaking of, we have somebody in the audience who's asking about escuelitas in Texas and
Mhm.
how does this complement or validate or intersect with with the escuelita story in Texas? So thank you, Renee and Edinburgh,
Yes.
for that question.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. I think the escuelitas are so amazing because they are informal schools on the one hand, and then we know that there are escuelitas that are sponsored by the Mexican government and set up in the public schools throughout the United States. Arizona is one of those places where Mexican American parents take on that tradition of escuelitas, and in fact, as early as the 1890s, I've seen families document how their grandparents would have them attend a Saturday school or a school after they attended public school during the day, that would allow them to continue their Spanish language education, their history of Mexico, their history of Spain. So escuelitas become it part of this, in essence, part of this dual school system that's in place. Mexican American youth are going to the U.S. public schools, and they're also attending the escuelitas simultaneously. So definitely there are connections. And I think that is an important question because it was very hard for me to make decisions about, am I going to study escuelitas? Am I going to study public schools? Am I going to study private schools, especially private Catholic schools? And I wanted to study the public schools to literally explain to people that Mexican Americans have been invested in public school education since the creation of those schools.
Mhm.
And in Arizona, we have that incredible example of Esteban Ochoa in 1871, helping to create that law.
Very important, very important. Thank you. More questions pouring in here. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Muñoz. I'm curious, how was the process of finding archives for your project? You shared many kinds of documents, photos, yearbooks, newspaper clippings. So question about your archival work.
My archival work was very dependent upon the incredible archivists at Arizona State and at the Chicano Research Collection at UCLA. Those archivists had done extensive work with their local communities to bring in records and sources. And so one of the very first things I did was to mine those archives. At Arizona State, at the Chicano Research Collection, Rebecca Muñoz's family donated her photograph collection and many documents from the Muñoz family. And so that became sort of the trail that I followed. There were examples, of course, from the Sotelo family that I mentioned, and those were also placed in that archive. There's a fabulous archive at the Tempe Historical Museum, and I also used some images from there. I literally looked for any possibility. And to be honest, I started with very, very basic sources, newspapers and yearbooks.
Mhm.
When I was doing the dissertation work, I went to the Arizona State University archives, pulled all the yearbooks, and literally went through every single page from 1886 to 1936 and looked for every Spanish surname, every club, anything I could find that would connect me to a Mexican American educational past.
Mhm. Wonderful. So,
Mhm.
families, if you've got things, don't throw them away. Maybe connect
Please,
with your local archive. Yes.
And
Okay.
connect with me if you need a place, if you're looking for someone, looking for a place to donate your records, or if you want to connect with MACRI, there's also so many of us who are ready and willing to help you do this work.
Yeah, so we wouldn't, people like Dr. Muñoz would not be able to create books like this if it weren't for those records,
Mhm,
right? So we need those things. We have a question from Arizona. And my husband's family, this is
mhm,
from an Arizona mining town, many left the mines because of the copper strike and became teachers. Did you
mhm.
find this in your research?
Definitely, definitely. I know many of the early conquis, a lot of them came from places like Miami Globe. And in fact, the town of Miami was known for having a state of the art segregated Mexican school built by the copper mining industry. That school is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's called Bullion Plaza, aptly named for the copper bullion that was processed by Mexican American miners in that town. Once children were able to successfully matriculate through the segregated schools, if their parents could afford for them to continue their education, many of them went on to high school. And then from high school, were recruited by their friends and by other graduates down to places like Tucson, places like Tempe to get their education and essentially move forward with that college degree. So I did see evidence of that in all of the cities and in all of the industries, not only within mining, but within agriculture, within ranching, um, throughout the state. There's definitely a pathway. And if we can compare it to chain migration that we see, families, reach back and take the next person. Mhm.
Very interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
I know you mentioned the Yaqui at one point, but here's another question. Was there education rights work that crossed with other communities like Native American and African American education?
I think that it's most obvious with the African American community, particularly after World War II, as Mexican American veterans and African American veterans began to assert their civil rights claims. We began to see the development of cross race politics in towns like Tucson and Phoenix. For example, Maria Urquidez joins. That one group that's fighting for desegregation. She actually is a board member, signs on to the articles of registration for the state for this organization. She and Gregorio Garcia and the Alianza are working very closely with African American leadership in Phoenix and Tucson to put forward this referendum to call for the end of segregation. So I would say that integrated approach to desegregation is really a post-World War II phenomenon.
Mhm.
I don't see that necessarily in the 10s and 20s when segregation is definitely in place and Mexicans are distancing themselves from Jim Crow. Um, they're still figuring out how to handle race relations. And we don't see that sort of developed consciousness and practice around integration until we get to the 40s. And I'm saying that based on what I've seen so far. I mean,
Mhm.
if there is evidence of Mexican American, African American, and Native American coordination around education before the 30s, I would love to see that and know about it.
Absolutely. And I think it goes without saying there's still work we can do to better work in solidarity across
Yes.
communities even today. I just wanted to let everybody know in the chat, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, we did put in a discount code. If you would like to order a copy of Desert Dreams, you can get it for 30% off right now with that discount code. So it really, Laura, congratulations on this fantastic book.
Thank you.
I I just think you're really making a very important intervention into how we understand that history of Mexican education and all of the work. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. There's one more person who wants to ask you a
Oh,
question. So
okay.
I wanna make sure we give him a chance here. Okay.
Mhm.
So is there a way to summarize the we were educated and uneducated at the same time? You'd mentioned this, Laura,
Mhm.
in your answer earlier, especially what appears to be a strong interest in promoting education. So if you just want to talk a little bit
Mhm.
more about that.
I think, the process of education is generational. So if we think about our backgrounds as migrants coming to the United States, that first generation is literally creating opportunities for settlement. How do we get our basic needs met? How do we get our children educated? And once we do that, we're actually able to, across the generations, build that. And that's happening simultaneously across this wide expanse of time. So we see this sort of mixed educational achievement where some Mexican Americans are succeeding in the public schools because they have some kind of grounding. Either their families have been here a little bit longer, or their families have a little bit more wealth, or there's some of us who are still in the process of integrating ourselves into American life and haven't had opportunities, whether they're educational, political, occupational, to make those leaps into higher education. So that's one of the reasons why I was talking about how we have this sort of unbalanced framework in place. And also, one of the critical points I'd like to make about that is that we often approach the history of Mexican American education as one of deficit. And one of the things I've tried to do in my work is show how Mexican Americans have been invested in education, have educated themselves, have entered the professions, and have reached back to challenge the ways that we've thought about Mexican American education. Is it a Mexican problem, or is it an Anglo perception of who Mexicans are? And that's what needs to be changed so that we can improve public school access and educational achievement for Mexican American youth. So I hope if you do read Desert Dreams that you get a sense of how I'm attempting to sort of push back against these notions of deficit and really highlight how many Mexican Americans were involved not only in attending public school, but in managing public schools in the early pre-1954 years.
Mhm. Mhm. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Munoz. Thank you for all of the folks who are watching from home. I also want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar
Mhm.
County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, AARP, Wells Fargo, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Foundation, and individual donors like you. It takes a village. Thank you, everybody. If you like tonight's presentation, we have more events coming up. For those of you who are in San Antonio, this Saturday, we have Dr. Lidia Otero joining us. Oops, let me put that back up. Dr. Lidia Otero, she's actually visiting from Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Otero has a new memoir, LA Interchanges, a Brown and Queer Archival Memoir, which will be discussed this Saturday. Refreshments at 5:30, talk starts at 6. Back in March of last year, Dr. Otero joined us for a virtual talk about their first memoir, about their childhood and the
Mhm.
intersections of their childhood with urban renewal. Fascinating story. And now this is part 2 of Dr. Otero's kind of coming of age in Los Angeles. And if you can join us, you'll love it, and you'll get to meet Dr. Otero in person. Also, in 2 weeks from today, we have another virtual talk. This time, we're going to visit Indiana. We're going to learn about Hoosier Latinos with Nicole Martinez-Legrand and Daniel Gonzalez, who will be telling us about a really long and fascinating history of Mexican Americans and other Latinos in Indiana. So if you can join us for any of those, we would love to see you. I encourage you to learn more about MACRI at somosmacri.org, where you can find our complete list of upcoming programs. Also, did you know that we're building the nation's first museum dedicated to Mexican American civil rights history? Yes, we are, and we do need your support. If you visit our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter, you can sign up to follow us on social media, you can make a donation, but you can keep up with all things MACRI. Thank you so much again, Dr. Muñoz, and to all of our viewers tonight. Gracias, and have a very good night.
Thank you.